Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again, this is Jay Shapiro. Thanks for listening. We are now at the very end of the period known as the counting of the Omer, which is the 49 days between Passover and the holiday of Shavuot. Shavuot is a day when we recall and celebrate the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai more than 3,500 years ago. It is a remarkable thing when you stop to think about it. The people of Israel, the Jews, started history together with a lot of other people and other empires that rose and fell and no longer exist. We preceded and outlived the civilizations like Greece and Rome, and we should be aware of these facts each year. This year, the period between Passover and Shavuot has been different than any other time because of the coronavirus. Many of us, if not most of us, have been housebound. It's been an interesting experience because many organizations, such as synagogues and schools and churches, have made use of the new technologies like Zoom to stay in contact with people and to provide education and social support. It is indeed a very, very unusual time, a time that none of us has ever experienced before. It's been challenging for individuals, for communities, and for governments. And as far as my program is concerned, what I will do is I will discuss several items, including the way that the Palestinian Authority is neglecting its own people in the face of the coronavirus, and the money that they're getting, instead of using to help their own people, they're using for terrorism. It is really quite tragic. And also I want to talk about the difficulty that some Jewish settler groups are having with accepting the Trump plan as it has been presented. There's a Chinese blessing, which is, I hope you don't live in interesting times. I'm afraid we haven't been that lucky. We live in extremely interesting times. There's never a dull moment. I'll be back after the break.
Always challenging the status quo. Hello, I'm Rod Bryant on Beyond the Matrix here at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. I want to encourage you to listen each week, every Wednesday at the same time, for an amazing show that will challenge you, inform you, and inspire. News, views, and wisdom for the nations here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Don't forget, Beyond the Matrix every week, Wednesday, here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
Be biblical.
Be beautiful.
Wear your crown.
Wrapping is my crown.
Do what married Jewish women have been doing for thousands of years. Celebrate the art of head wrapping. I'm Andrea Grinberg from Rapunzel.com. We have beautiful scarves, stunning accessories, scarves for faith, scarves for healing, and scarves for fun. Rapunzel.com. That's Rapunzel with a W. Or click on our banner on the Israel News Talk Radio homepage.
Rapunzel.com. Beautiful scarves, stunning accessories paired with tutorials, support, and a vibrant community to give you everything you need to start and perfect your head covering journey.
Don't forget, join the Rapunzel community group on Facebook to see, learn, and share your beautiful wraps. That's Rapunzel with a W on Facebook.
I love Rapunzel.
I love Rapunzel.
I love Rapunzel.
Get 10% off your purchase with promo code RADIO. Go now to Rapunzel.com.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. Because of the pandemic, a lot of other really important items are slipping under the radar, and I want to say a few words about one of them, and that is the Trump plan. The initial flush of the January unveiling of Trump's plan, everybody got excited over the possibility of United States support for the application of Israel's sovereignty over 30% of the West Bank, essentially half of what's called Area C, which is the area where there's Jewish settlements. This would include annexing all the Israeli settlements. Even more significant, the annexation could be done at the start of the peace process and was not dependent on the successful outcome of any negotiations with the Palestinians. That was the most important part, I think, about the Trump plan. You could start it right away. Now, the Trump plan provided for the most generous offer made to Israel by any American-led peace process so far. In the past peace initiatives, it was presumed a certain number of Jewish settlements would be forcibly uprooted. In contrast, Trump's plan has promised that settlers could stay in their homes and could actualize one of their most cherished goals, which is the transformation of the biblical heartland into part of sovereign Israel. Now, initially, the settlers applauded the sovereignty portion of the plan. However, they stood in opposition to the portions of the document that dealt with the creation of a Palestinian state on the other 70% of the West Bank. Now, there is an organization called the Yesha Council. Yesha stands for Yehuda V'Shomron, Judea and Samaria. And the Yesha Council is an organization with all the heads of the various communities in Judea and Samaria. They form a council. Now, what's happened is that the Yesha Council has become concerned that the sovereignty portion of the plan would be applied in such a way that it would rob many of them of the ability to conduct a normal life and thus lead in the end to the demise of a certain number of settlements. And according to the head of one of the heads of the Yesha Council, a fellow named Boaz Haetzny, who lives in Kiryat Arba, which is in the city of Hebron, he says the plan tries to give us the settlements and take away the land, which is the exact opposite of what had been intended, because the settlements are there to ensure a Jewish hold on the land. So a situation may have been created by the Trump plan where sovereignty has become the problem and not the solution. The Yesha Council warned last week against the plan and issued its red lines. This included three principal points. The Yesha Council objected to any plan that allowed for the creation of a Palestinian state. It also rejected any plan that freezes or restricts Jewish building, and it also objected to the creation of small Israeli enclaves. According to the Yesha Council, and I quote, Yesha has worked for years for the application of sovereignty at a time when almost no one spoke of the idea or recognized it. We have arrived at an unprecedented situation in which the Prime Minister and the U.S. President are discussing an agreement that includes sovereignty. That's good. However, we won't agree to the creation of a Palestinian state in Israel's heartland. It is a result of this agreement. If the result of this agreement is the creation of a terrorist state in Judea and Samaria, which will create isolated enclaves and include a settlement freeze, then we are ready to give up on sovereignty in spite of all the work and all the resources we have invested in this endeavor over the years. Now, this is interesting. This is a major statement by the leaders of the Yesha Council. Now, there are several settler leaders who explain why they support the plan. In other words, there are the settlement leadership is now divided on whether to accept the plan or not to accept the plan. And this is very interesting. Those in favor of accepting the plan say, and again I quote, "We are at the precipice of a historic moment of international recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Jewish land of Judea and Samaria." The deal of the century, that is Trump's deal of the century, is a defining test for the leadership of Judea and Samaria. And the leadership that is in favor of the Trump plan likened this moment to the 1937 Peel Commission and the 1947 UN Partition Plan. The settler leaders essentially speculated that had the Zionist Congress accepted partition in 1937, perhaps a Jewish state would have been created before World War II, which could have absorbed European Jewish immigration, thereby saving many lives. 10 years later, after the Second World War, the Zionist leadership understood it needed to accept the partition plan, even though it fell short of their expectations. This is what the settler leaders are now saying. And I quote, because their words are very important. They said there are formative moments like these at the junction of decision making where the implications are historically significant and have an irreversible impact on the future. We, the heads of the settlement movement in Judea and Samaria, are experiencing such a moment. We can seize this opportunity to implement sovereignty in large sections of our land, even if our entire dream is still not realized. We must secure what we have. We must say yes to Trump's deal of the century. Unquote. Now, at issue is, in particular, for opponents of the Trump plan, is the fate of about 15 settlements, which, under the terms of the Trump plan, would become small islands within an otherwise large swath of Palestinian territory. And this is what they are opposed to. Now, what's really interesting is that those who support the plan, those in the settlement movement who support the plan, believe that the Palestinians will never engage in the process. In other words, the Palestinians, according to the plan, the Palestinians have been given 4 years in which to agree to the Trump plan, and then they'll get a lot of money from the American government, and they can make their little state or their semi-state or whatever you want to call it. In the meantime, the Palestinian leadership is totally opposed to the Trump plan, and they refuse to even sit down and talk about it. So what's happening is those who support the plan in the settlement movement, as I said a moment ago, figure out that the Palestinians will never engage in the process at all. As a result, they believe a Palestinian state would not be created after 4 years, and any restrictions on any of the building by the Jews would stop. The access and movement would be lifted. Even if that were not the case and the plan is successful, it is better to allow for U.S. to prove sovereignty than to miss a historic opportunity. So those in favor of accepting plans say, get what you can. That's the same thing the Zionist leadership did after the Second World War, and that's how the state of Israel came into being. So this is the struggle that is now going on among the settlement leadership, and our prime minister has said that in June he will apply Israeli sovereignty to the Jordan Valley. So we are undoubtedly at a very, very sensitive moment in history, and whatever steps we take are going to have affect the entire future. So hopefully our leadership will make the right decision, because undoubtedly the way history is, these opportunities will simply not return again. So we have to do what we can to ensure we can get what we can out of the opportunity that has been offered to us. So I hope in this few moments I've clarified the situation or the positions. I'll be back after the break.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with Love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with Love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. I want to say a few words about the Gaza Strip and the pandemic. While doctors and nurses and many Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are complaining about a shortage of medical supplies, the Palestinian armed groups, which are about 3, do not appear to be facing the same problem. Since 2014, Hamas has invested about $120 million per year in the terror tunnels. Quality concrete goes into the construction of these tunnels instead of into residential buildings. In addition, electricity is redirected to build and light up the tunnels 24 hours a day, while hospitals and the homes of civilians suffer constant power outages. According to various estimates, a terror tunnel can cost anything from $3 to $10 million, depending on its length and depth. Palestinians, particularly those living in the Gaza Strip, do not speak out against this, simply because they are afraid for their lives. Palestinians in the Gaza Strip need jobs, and they need proper health care more than they need rockets and tunnels. The leaders of Iran and the terrorist groups like Hamas are determined to pursue their goal of eliminating Israel. The biggest losers in this are really the 2 million Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip, while their money is being wasted on Palestinian terror groups and militias. The use of gloves and hand sanitizers for terrorism comes now something new, as Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are complaining about a shortage of drugs and medical equipment needed to fight the pandemic. In the past few weeks, Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health in Gaza has repeatedly turned to international institutions and international aid organizations to provide drugs and medical equipment to the Gaza Strip in light of the outbreak of this virus. Now, one of the countries that's supporting them is China. China has responded to the appeal by supplying a package of medical assistance to the Gaza Strip. An advanced Chinese medical laboratory in line with international standards is coming from China to the Gaza Strip. A positive role is being played by China in staying by the Palestinians at these critical times, and they said that the medical devices provided by the Chinese would enhance the capability of the Palestinians to fight the pandemic. What the Chinese and the rest of the world need to know is that the medical aid to the Gaza Strip is being used not only to help combat the pandemic, but also for facilitating jihad, holy war against Israel. For the various terrorist organizations, the war against Israel seems to be more important than the battle to stem the spread of this disease. While doctors, nurses, and many Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are complaining about a shortage of medical supplies, the Palestinian armed groups do not appear to be facing the same problem. These groups, in fact, have even made sure that their militiamen are equipped not only with weapons, but also with protective medical gear, such as gloves, hygienic masks, and sanitizer gel. So why do heavily armed Palestinian militiamen need protective medical gear? The answer is because they want to distribute the gloves and sanitizer gel to medical teams or needy families in the Gaza Strip? No, I'm afraid that is not the answer. They want to protect themselves while they're digging tunnels into Israel. The militiamen want the medical protective gear in order to facilitate their mission of building new tunnels along the Gaza-Israel border for the purpose of infiltrating into Israel and kidnapping and killing as many Israelis as possible. They also want the protective gear in order to install more rockets in underground launch sites in the Gaza Strip. These terrorist organizations are now trying to assure Palestinians that the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic does not mean that these groups have abandoned the jihad against Israel. A video clip recently issued by the military media of one of the armed rings, the Al-Quds brigades, states that our jihad is continuing and our determination is stronger. At the beginning of this video clip, masked militiamen are shown rubbing their hands with alcohol gel before putting on blue latex gloves. At first glance, it appears as if the militiamen are engaged in some kind of an activity to help combat the spread of the coronavirus among the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. It quickly turns out, however, that the militiamen are on a different mission that is completely unrelated to the health and safety of their people. The masked men are not covering their faces or wearing gloves because they're worried about the virus. Instead, they're wearing gloves and using hand sanitizers as they prepare to descend into a tunnel built to enable Palestinians to infiltrate from the Gaza Strip into Israel. Once they're inside the tunnel, the militiamen are seen carrying out construction and drilling work. Since 2014, and this is a mind-boggling number, Hamas has spent about $120 million per year building these terror tunnels. Quality concrete goes into the construction of these tunnels instead of residential buildings. In addition, electricity is redirected to build and light up the tunnels 24 hours a day, while hospitals and the homes of civilians suffer constant power outages. According to various estimates, a terror tunnel can cost anywhere from $3 to $10 million, depending on its length and depth. Last year, the Israel Air Force jets destroyed various weapon trucks headed to the Gaza Strip from Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. The shipments included Iranian missiles meant for a terrorist organization to use against Israel. A former advisor to Iran's president held an interview back in February 2019 on a Russian TV, and he said that Iran's military capabilities are directed towards Palestine and that Iran is sending weapons to the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. He said that Iran supports Palestinians from every faction, not just the Islamists, and that the Palestinian factions must be united within a framework of guns, popular uprising, and armed factions that would uproot Zionism. The Zionist entity must be dismantled either peacefully or by war. That's a quote. According to an Israeli intelligence report, Hamas and other organizations enjoy extensive material backing from Iran and their efforts to arm themselves because Tehran is determined to amplify its influence in the Palestinian area and among the Palestinian terrorist groups. So, an Israeli military analyst said that Hamas and its allies in the Gaza Strip have a variety of advanced, precise, and effective weaponry, including anti-tank missiles and shoulder-launched anti-aircraft missiles, both produced by Russia, as well as drones. Earlier this year, the Israeli army noted that it had thwarted an attempt to smuggle weapons into the Gaza Strip by sea from the Sinai Peninsula. The vessel used in the smuggling attempt was boarded by Israeli naval commandos, and the Israeli army did not share details about the weapons. So this attempt to smuggle weapons into the Gaza Strip, another sign of how that millions of dollars are being spent in terrorist activities against Israel. Interestingly enough, these Palestinian groups have never attempted to smuggle medicine or medical equipment into the Gaza Strip. Perhaps they do not care particularly about their people's health and safety. The leaders of these organizations want Israel and other countries and aid organizations to dispatch medical supplies to the Gaza Strip. They do not have the time, it seems, to attend to their people's needs. They're too busy preparing their jihad against Israel. Palestinians, particularly those living in the Gaza Strip, do not speak out against these organizations. They're afraid for their lives. They're also afraid that if they dare to criticize these organizations, they'll be accused of collaboration with Israel. Truth of the matter is, the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip need jobs. They need proper health care more than they need rockets and tunnels. The leaders of these organizations are determined to pursue their goal of eliminating Israel. Biggest losers are the 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, who really suffer in many areas, including health. So I just wanted to share this information with the listeners so they'll know what's happening in the Gaza Strip. I'll be back after the break.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Bentako, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany's but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
We're back with Jay Shapiro. In this segment of the program, I want to get away from the politics, away from the virus, away from what's happening in Judea and Samaria, and do what I like to call under the radar. These are items about Israel or the Jewish community that don't get the headlines, but they're of interest. Now, the first item I want to talk about is something which is fairly unique to Israel. In Israel, it's possible to start digging somewhere and suddenly find some kind of an archaeological dig that's thousands of years old. I remember years ago when I lived in Rehovot, somebody was building a house and they had to do away with half the parking area because they found an ancient building there. It was about 2,000 years old. Now, the latest ones that we've come across was found by a little kid. There is a place called Tel Juma, which is a few kilometers from the Gaza Strip border, and it's a quiet place, but apparently several thousand years ago, as a matter of fact, about 3,500 years ago, it's estimated, there was the theater of raging battles between local kings. A unique testimony to brutality of these conflicts was uncovered by chance about a month or two ago by a 6-year-old kid who was a resident of a kibbutz nearby, Kibbutz Nirim. In March, this kid, his name was Imri Elia, he went to visit the Tel Gemma archaeological site with his family. He spotted an unusual object on the ground. It was a small engraved clay tablet featuring two human figures. The boy's parents alerted the Israel Antiquities Authority, and after analyzing this little thing, they determined it probably dates back to the late Bronze Age, about 3,500 years. It's a very unique finding, and according to Israel Antiquities Authority, nothing similar was ever uncovered in excavations in Israel. And the head of the IAA, the Israel Antiquities Authority, said, "We are aware that a somewhat similar piece was found in northern Sinai, but we do not know exactly what it looks like, since the excavation was conducted about 100 years ago, and there's not very accurate publication about it." Tel Gemma, by the way, was first excavated a century ago, and the place was settled, according to the researchers, about 6,000 years ago, and it remained inhabited until the 1st century BCE. So this is very interesting. Here a kid went with his parents for a picnic, came across the 3,500-year-old object, and it's a small finding in a big story. And for his discovery, this kid, 6 years old, received a certificate of good citizenship. Now, the truth of the matter is that antiquities are our cultural heritage, and each find adds to the entire picture, the story of the Holy Land. And it's important in turning archaeological findings over to the National Treasuries Department so they can be researched and displayed for the entire public to enjoy. So what happened, this kid, 6-year-old kid, found it. He's a good citizen, and his parents, of course. And so our hats off to them for finding this thing. Another thing is, on the same subject, in the first centuries of the Common Era, several Christian settlements flourished in the Negev desert, and their agriculture thrived. Now the question is, how did they manage to tame that environment, which is very inhospitable, and what caused their decline? And a research group by a group of Israeli archaeologists from the various universities here are working on it, and they're trying to figure out who lived in these areas, what they did for a living. And for a long time, the researchers believed that these areas in the Negev were what they call Nabatean, established by pagan nomadic people who lived in the southern Levant and Saudi Arabia. However, many researchers, including the present teams working on it, identify them as Byzantine agricultural communities established from the 2nd century CE. So, in other words, they could well have been Christians or early Christians. And they estimate, based on the findings, that around 2,000 people probably lived in this settlement, where they found the ruins of several churches. So it doesn't leave any doubt about the identity of those who lived here. We're talking within the first 200 years after Christianity began. And there was no sign of Jewish life uncovered at the site. They found 170 houses and agricultural installations and dams and cisterns and wine presses. So apparently it was an active community. By the way, the presence of wine presses suggests they grew grapevines. While in the trash pits near the houses, archaeologists were able to identify seeds and plants. So it's interesting that living in Israel, you can dig down and find some history you didn't expect. So the issue of what the Negev looked like 1,500 years ago is connected to what brought about the collapse of the Christian communities, according to the researchers. It could be that various causes brought the end of these settlements and the researching. So as the head researcher said from the university, something happened in the Negev, but exactly what remains an enigma. It's something. It's not so much unique to Israel. It's pretty much unique to this whole area. I've traveled in Jordan and seen the remains of places that are thousands of years old, but it's very nice. It's something interesting about the Middle East, and one of the interesting things about Israel is that the people are sensitive and aware. Here you have a 6-year-old kid who found something unusual. He showed it to his parents, and his parents, instead of taking it home and hanging up on the wall, they gave it over to the Israel Antiquities Authority. In other words, people are sensitive that we dig down, we find history, and all the remnants of that history should be placed in the proper hands. So that speaks well of the education of the kids here. The next item has absolutely nothing to do with the previous items, but I found it so interesting and so piquant that I must share it with the listeners. The former Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, issued a scathing attack on his successor, Netanyahu, in an interview on the radio earlier this week. He said that he's an expert on some of the affairs that the present Prime Minister has been involved in, because he is the only other prime minister besides Netanyahu to have brought submarines from Germany. There's a whole affair about submarines. Now, Olmert based what he said on what's already known and not on what is yet unknown. Now, Olmert, the former prime minister, went on to say that Netanyahu committed a serious case of fraud. And Olmert went on to say, and I quote, Netanyahu is a criminal, a liar, and a cheat who has committed crimes. I certainly see him being sent to prison and sitting there for more than just a few years. Now, the reason I'm sharing this with the listeners is because the former Prime Minister Olmert just finished serving 16 months in prison for bribery and fraud. So here you have Olmert, the former jailbird, being interviewed by the radio to ask him what he thinks about the fact that the present prime minister is under indictment and his court case has just started. So I think one can say that Olmert, as I said, a former jailbird, is probably an expert on the subject of breaking the law. And it's interesting that the radio is interesting in getting his opinion. I guess you can call it an expert opinion. And just to complete the program, I started this section talking about archaeological digs. Now I can say something about the newest interesting thing in Israel, and that is the fact that 8 new deputy ministers were sworn in at the Knesset on Monday, a week after the swearing in of 34 cabinet ministers. Israel has 34 cabinet ministers and 8 deputy ministers. That brings us to over 40 people having offices, drivers, most of them have guards, and budgets and so forth. So little Israel, with about 9 million people, now has a government bigger than India, the United States. As a matter of fact, it has a government, I think, just bigger than any other country in the world. But, one of the signs of the coming of the Messiah is that people are not ashamed of what they do. That's what the Talmud says. So here you have a government with more than 40 ministers and partial ministers, and they're not ashamed about it. So it could well be that according to the Talmud, our present government is helping bring the coming of the Messiah, because they have absolutely no shame using up the budget and the taxpayers' money just to give themselves offices and drivers. Having said that, take care of yourselves until next time. Let's hope the news is always good. Jay Shapiro signing off.
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.